Hi, I'm Amos Himmelstein, Vice President and Chief Operating Officer here at Occidental College. Welcome to the Lucille Y. Gilman Memorial Fountain. This iconic fountain has quite the story to tell. I'd like to share some of its story with you today. The sculpture you see here is the work of artist, Oxy alumnus, and 33-year faculty member George Baker, class of 1958. Baker created many kinetic sculptures over his career, and the one here, created with students specifically for our campus, is called Water Forms 2. If it weren't for a push from one of his sculpture students and the advice of Lucille Gilman, the wife of the Occidental president at the time, Richard Gilman, we may not have this iconic work of art here at Occidental today. I'd like to now introduce Mark Roundtree, class of 1979, and a member of the 12-student class that helped create this wonderful work of art.
Greetings from Louisville, Kentucky. I'm Mark Roundtree, class of 1979, and 42 years ago this week, I was one of the dozen students helping George Baker build his amazing fountain at Occidental. And it's a real honor to join you today to talk about how we built that fountain and to remember Lucille Gilman. Sometime around 1976, after George Baker installed a kinetic wind sculpture in Nebraska, he suggested the idea of a fountain for the existing Herrick Chapel pool, which had simple vertical shooting water pipes at the time, but it wasn't until the fall of 1977 that Sheldon Marks, class of 1978, brought up the idea of revisiting this fountain. Like me, Sheldon and many students had a close connection with Lucille Gilman, the wife of President Richard Gilman, because Mrs. G, as we called her, was a constant presence on campus, and she opened their home for gourmet cooking classes. I took her class, so did Sheldon Marks. Sheldon took the fountain proposal to Mrs. Gilman, and she loved the idea, and she encouraged Sheldon that he just press on.
When I found out that he had offered at one time to build a sculpture in this fountain, and that the idea had gone by the wayside, I realized that this was something that I could get involved in as my contribution to Occidental. With the support of Mrs. Gilman and my wife, the project was brought to the attention of important faculty and administrators.
Sadly, on June 26, 1978, Lucille Gilman passed away suddenly. That was the end of my junior year, and I'll never forget the outpouring of love for Mrs. G and the feeling that we had lost a dear friend of us all. After her passing, many friends and staff and alumni contributed to a fund in Mrs. Gilman's memory, and President Gilman decided the perfect use of those gifts would be to fund the fountain in her memory. The trustees agreed, and the project shifted into gear in the fall of 1978. Professor Baker began the planning process for the sculpture almost immediately, working over Christmas break of 1978.
It actually is very nice to sit here and relax for a few minutes and sort of think about these things.
And in spring of 1979, a special class was announced to allow us students to work on the project. 27 students applied with no art or sculpture experience required, and 12 students from various majors were chosen. I was lucky enough to be chosen to be one of those 12 students, and I really hoped to learn more about George Baker and his process than I had learned in a class I'd taken, and it was with George's help that I soon understood that art isn't just a product or a thing that you hang on a wall. Art is really the process of making the art. The class began with training during the last week of March, and 12 large sheets of stainless steel arrived. There we were on day one, a bunch of green sculptors that had more ambition than experience. As students, our primary responsibility was to cut and polish the pieces. Our guide was a small cigar box-sized model and a thick stack of blueprints. The class was split into two groups, with 6 students working in the morning and 6 students working in the afternoon shift. They just picked up where we left off in the morning. So the building process was anything but repetitive for us. The patterns, which were projected from the plans and traced onto large sheets of paper on a wall, were laid out on sheets of steel, and then we students cut them out using a nibbler, a small, loud tool that literally nibbled away at the steel with a carbide tooth that left a silver trail of chunks at our feet. Following all that nibbling, the rough edges were smoothed with belt sanders and grinders, and in order to create the curved shapes, the pieces were then taken to a local business that had a special roller process that produced the curved shape that Baker had designed. The shaped pieces were then welded as needed by an expert welder, and we students then installed the bearings and did the finishing, which involved lots and lots and lots of sanding and polishing. So the final sculpture is composed of 13 large pieces of very heavy, 1/4-inch thick stainless steel. There are 8 circular shapes and 5 what we call surfboard shapes, elongated shapes. The largest weighs nearly 1/4 of a ton, and the smallest shape weighs less than 100 pounds. The entire sculpture, Waterforms 2, is 22 feet long and 15 feet wide at the base and rises about 12 feet out of the water. Now, 7 of these pieces are balanced very carefully on ball bearings, and so the slightest wind or jet of water will cause them to rock back and forth gently. While the sculpture itself can be described by all these numbers, the project for me was above all else about the people.
To the student assistants who labored throughout the spring term and into the early summer. They are the ones who persisted and made my concept a reality. To each of them belongs a certain portion of this fountain, a certain possessiveness and responsibility.
That 1979 crew consisted of George Baker, of course, and a dozen students, plus Peter Greenleaf, class of 1975, who was George Baker's chief consultant. We built the entire sculpture in what we used to call the Art Barn and is now called Samuelson Pavilion. And in order to test the frame, Greenleaf devised a pulley system that allowed us to lift the heavy pieces into place for testing. But we had to figure out how to get these pieces of steel from the Art Barn down to Herrick Pool. So Vic Macco, class of 1979, another of the students on our crew, created a very simple brace made of pine beams that could be used to lift the discs. We still didn't know how we were going to haul all these discs down to the fountain from the Art Barn. John Kastner, class of 1981, was also one of the students who was on the crew, and he was a member of the ATO fraternity, and John suggested that perhaps his fraternity brothers could help get all this steel down to the fountain. So, in exchange for some kegs of beer, the ATOs carried the structure down from the Art Barn to the pool where we installed it. The entire process took the ATOs about 1 hour. Waterforms 2 was fully installed by the end of June 1979, although I know George Baker spent the summer working on the water portion of that sculpture. The waterworks would run on a 15-minute cycle, and there were 13 nozzles controlled by 3 program motors. Now, George Baker was really ahead of his time with his very big ideas, but the technology to drive this sculpture and his dream just didn't quite exist yet. His real artistic vision had the fountain sculpture lined up central to the architectural lines of the entrance of the campus. But unfortunately, this would have required rebuilding and moving the entire pool by Herrick Chapel, and the plans had been lost for that pool, so the fountain was placed at the center of the existing pool instead of the center line of the campus as George had wished. Now, 42 years later, the newly rebuilt fountain is actually re-centered exactly where George would have wanted it, and I think he'd be extremely pleased today. On November 19th, 1979, the fountain was formally dedicated during homecoming weekend with several hundred in attendance. Franklin Murphy, a friend of the Gilman family who was a former chancellor at UCLA and chair of the Times-Mirror Company, spoke at the dedication that day. He spoke of how four forces came together that afternoon: the spirit of Lucille Gilman, the creative genius of man, the commitment of higher education to the arts, and what he called the opportunity of generations of Occidental College students to be touched either directly or indirectly by the movement of this beautiful fountain. Although 4 decades have come and gone, this beautiful fountain still illuminates our lives. The Lucille Y. Gilman Memorial Fountain was always a wonderful tribute to a woman who meant so much to me and countless Oxy students, staff, faculty, and alumni. I couldn't be more proud to have been part of that student crew, and I'm so grateful to all of you who made this day possible. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this.
Over the years, the Lucille Gilman Memorial Fountain has been enjoyed by students, alumni, and the community as a central gathering place for events, concerts, commencement, receptions during reunion, and homecoming. It has also become a tradition for students to get thrown into the fountain on their birthday. You may even recognize it from such films and television shows like Clueless, Beverly Hills 90210, Don't Be a Menace, and most notably Star Trek III, The Search for Spock. However, in recent years, the fountain and surrounding pool were showing their age. The pool itself leaked so badly that it could only hold water for a matter of days. Not only was it expensive to keep full, it was not environmentally friendly. Repairing the fountain turned into a complete restoration project, which, with the encouragement of then-President Jonathan Veatch, quickly turned into a transformational project for this section of the campus. The entire area was regraded to replace the entry steps with a sloping path to open up the front of campus and allow for easy access to the fountain space. And the old square pool was replaced with a more elliptical shape, with black basalt walls that give the illusion of an infinity edge as water ripples over the basalt and is recycled into the pool. In a nod to environmental concerns, permeable concrete pavers in the plaza keep rainwater from flowing into the street. The sculpture was taken apart and sent for restoration of all the steel parts and reassembled with new joints between all of the panels. The old white pool spotlights were replaced with LEDs in order to save energy. The new lights allow for a choice of color, so the fountain can be lit in many different ways. Although the fountain looks much as it did when it was first installed, a few key things were changed. You'll notice the darker color of the pool, allowing for better reflection. And there's one more very important change that was made. The sculpture is not centered in the new, elongated pool, but moved toward the front of the ellipse. This allows for more reflective space in the water to really show off the fountain. And the biggest reason for the shift is now the sculpture itself is in line with the chapel doors and more in line with the central access to the campus, much like Baker originally envisioned. The renovation of the fountain was recently completed after 12 months of work. For the Oxy community, the fountain is a poignant reminder of Lucille Gilman's contributions to the college. As son Tucker Gilman said, the fountain and plaza area gracefully and warmly welcomed people at the front entrance of the Oxy campus, just as Lucille Gilman graciously and warmly welcomed everyone to the college and to the president's house, whether for her famous cooking class, a holiday open house, or for a faculty or trustee reception. Thank you, Lucille. Thank you to the Gilman family. Thank you to George Baker and his students for this campus icon that will continue to welcome Oxy students for generations to come.